He recorded one 45 single called I'm Gonna Murder My Baby, where he's announcing to a judge and jury in advance of his own crime, I just want to tell you, I'm going to murder my baby if she don't stop cheating and lying. He was involved with a married woman, convinced that she was cheating on him, busted into her apartment, and he shot her and a first responder police officer, and both of them died.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Life, we all know, is dictated by death. It lurks behind us, our constant companion, impelling action and reverie, both languid and tense. If many trade belief in a literal soul for some notion of psychic essence, few wish to give up the secular ghost too soon, or unexpectedly, or even at all. So it makes sense that some souls dictate songs about it, try to capture something key or novel or timeless about the inevitable in as immediate and emotive a form as music. That's an excerpt from a brand new book by Stephen L. Jones called Murder Ballads Old and New, a dark and bloody record. The book is an exploration of an age-old topic, our human need to document the horrors of the world around us. Stephen is here to talk about the origins of the murder ballad, what makes up a horror ballad, and some of the murder ballads recorded in punk, post-punk, alt-country, and folk by artists including Johnny Cash, The Smiths, Bob Dylan, The Clash, The Drive-By Truckers, Lou Reed, and some obscure songs with stories that are almost hard to believe are true, including a 1954 song which would eerily forecast the doom for the man who created a song called I'm Gonna Murder My Baby. This story and many more coming up with Stephen L. Jones. You can hear a playlist of the murder ballads we talk about in this episode on the show notes page. Stephen, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me for the meeting.
First, let's start with, how would you define a murder ballad?
Well, the sort of classic definition of a murder ballad, which I stray from in the book, but murder ballads, they generally refer to traditional songs about homicide that are based partly or mostly in fact, but over time become folklore because they're adapted. Sometimes they're passed down for centuries. And a lot of them came from England and Scotland. They were collected by a musicologist in book form in the 19th century named Francis Child. So a lot of them are called child ballads. But a lot of them came to Appalachia with the Scots-Irish, because a lot of them were Scottish, the Scots-Irish and the English, some Scandinavian, Irish. It's not just them, but a lot of them originated in Scotland and England, came to America and became part of what later would be called country music. They were hillbilly songs sung in Appalachia, and there are variants like what are sometimes called broadsheet style that are more about current events, like songs like Stagger Lee, about an actual murder that took place in early 20th century St. Louis, and they have a kind of newspaper-like feel. But the really old ones, one of the things that's interesting about them is by the time they arrive in our time, because people continue to play them and record them, they're often altered by the artist in bits and pieces. So you can trace whole genealogies of these songs. So that's the standard definition. I expanded it in this book and in some of the articles that published it before. There've been a lot of writing about murder ballads in the last 10, 20 years. And I wanted to focus also just on songs of tragedy, songs about unimaginable tragedy and death. So I extended the subject to include war, madness, terminal illness, natural disasters, coal mining disasters, car wrecks, and even things like funeral customs, and to some degree, just the inevitability of death and having to face it. So that's the not short answer. The traditional songs tend to be collected by musicologists and people in universities, but they got a lot of publicity in the last around the turn of the century, but because of the re-release of something called the Anthology of American Folk Music that collected some of these songs, and people like Nick Cave and PJ Harvey did updates, did old songs new, or did adaptations of these old ideas. And so it had a new currency, kind of a revival around the turn of the 21st century.
The book comes out of a collection of essays you originally wrote for a blog called Murder Ballad Monday. So the question is, what was it that drew you to these songs initially? What is your fascination with this genre? Is it a genre?
I should clarify first, about half of them in their first form were in Murder Ballad Monday, which was part of the folk journal Sing Out. The other ones were written specifically for the book. But in answer to the big question, and I really wish I had a punchy, sexy answer, like, I remember the first time I heard a murder ballad and it blew me away. And I honest to God don't. It was a piecemeal thing. I've been immersed in music all my life, came from a musical family. My father was a choir director, and my mother was a violinist. So I was hearing everything from classical to jazz to pop to country when I grew up. I grew up in Kentucky, so there was a lot of country music around. So one of the inputs was my family. My mother's side of the family were country people, descended from dirt farmers in rural Kentucky. And my grandfather was a carpenter who made his own guitars. I grew up hearing him. We would go visit him in the country from Louisville, the city where I lived, and he would play story songs that he had written, and he would also play current country hits by Dolly Parton and Porter Wagner and stuff like that. And some of these songs would slip in there. And I don't have a clear grasp because I was so young, but I know that that kind of piqued my interest. And then I was a huge rock and roll fan. You know, that was the music of my era. And I was also a voracious reader about rock and roll. So I knew about its country roots, its blues roots and stuff like that. And I kept coming across mention of these songs, especially in relation to people like Bob Dylan and the band. You know, they would mention these weird old folk songs and these dark folk songs. And it just piqued my interest. And then I mentioned there's this thing called the Smithsonian Anthology of American Folk Music. It was compiled by a real oddball named Harry Smith. He was a record collector. He was also an artist and a cultist. As a real character with the Chelsea Hotel. But he compiled it from records that were recorded in the late 20s and early 30s, in the early days of, you know, commercial recording, 78 RPM, you know, shellac records. And he included a lot of murder ballads and a lot of songs of tragedy in this collection. And it was re-released on CD in 1997. And that's when it became a mania for me. Because any of us who love music, like I'm sure we both do, there are touchstones like that where you heard something and you were never the same again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of those Wizard of Oz moments where the door opens and everything's now in color. Like I had never imagined that there was such a rich. I just thought folk music. I had this conception that's sort of boring and, you know, unsophisticated. And then I heard all these gripping, touching, tragic, weird songs, many of them about death. And from that point on, it really did become a kind of mania. And I've always been a history buff and somebody who researches genealogy. And researching these songs, collecting them, learning about them is a lot like genealogy because they have ancestors, they have cousins. And I became really intrigued by mapping that out. One of the things I wanted to point out was people still make songs like this.
Yeah, this book gets right up until the current day. In fact, actually, Stephen, you got me to listen to Bob Dylan's JFK song, Murder Most Foul.
Yeah.
And I remember when it first came out a few years back, that's good, you know, but I was more focused or more preoccupied with the length of the song. And then when November came around, 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination, I found myself just enthralled with that song. I listened to it over and over again last weekend.
Yeah, it has that quality of almost of like incantation. And a lot of old time music does. And Dylan, you know, is famous for having 80 verses to a song, you know, but, you know, it becomes hypnotic after a while and you just keep seeing the images. And I think that event, the JFK assassination, is is kind of still an open wound in this culture. So I thought it was fascinating that he did that.
But to what you're saying, the book is current, goes right up until the current day.
Yeah, I think the oldest song in the book is from the 13th century, and that's the first chapter, first section. And I think the most recent one's from 2014. There was a 2017, but we had to edit it for length.
But the Dylan one is 2020 or 2021.
Oh, you're right. You're right. See, I don't know my book.
I think, or did it come out during the COVID? I think it came out during COVID.
It did come out during COVID. Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone keeps thinking he's done, and then he comes out with something else.
There's an emotional connection to this. The introduction to the book, beautifully written, quite emotional. Can you share with the listeners a bit of that, your background, how your difficult experiences with loss of loved ones inspired you to write this book?
I want to preface it by saying I'm not different than anyone else. That's one of the things that drew me to want to write about this, because I've said before, some people, they think this is going to be a lurid true crime book. Well, there's some of that in there because there's ghastly murders in it. But, instead of being a book about terrible things that happen to people, it's a book about how people cope with terrible things that happen to them and how they turn to music, and especially songs, which are kind of simple and singable and shareable. But for me, I had, like many of us do, just one of these gluts where several tragedies happen in a row, or it's so devastating. You feel like, how am I going to get through this? I lost my mother, three of my mother's sisters, and my first wife within a 2-year period, all to cancer. And it happened at a point in my life where we had just bought our first house. She had just been sworn in as an attorney. We were going to start a family. So it was just a devastating experience. And I mentioned it in the introduction because it remains to this day. This happened, I'm getting up there. This was a while ago, but it was the most life-changing experience I ever had, and it's still with me. And it was the first time I had to rethink everything in my life and really confront head-on what we don't like to, which is death, and the agony of watching a loved one perish when there's nothing we can do to help, which all of us eventually experience. It changed me, and I spent a lot of years. I made more personal art. I'm also a painter, and I made more personal art. And I just tried to kind of tackle this notion of generations of family and of loss and how we cope. And it helped me feel a kinship with other people. We feel so distant and alien. And, I've always fervently believed if we could cut through a lot of external stuff, we have far more in common, than what separates us. And what do we have more in common than loss? Everyone has to suffer that. So that definitely was one of the things that led me to poke into this subject and to talk about it. And there was, by the time I finished it, it took a little over 2 years to write. There was a real feeling of closure.
Yeah.
Like, you're never done with this subject, but I had tackled a big chunk of it and felt like I'd made peace with it.
You did talk about the songs going back to, I think you said, with the 1300s.
I started the whole book with the earliest song. It's a song called Fatal Flower Garden.
Yeah, that's where I was going with. Yeah, the very first Murder Ballad. That's the one, right?
That's the earliest one in the book. It's not the
in
earliest
the book. Okay, because I'm wondering how far back does this go then?
Francis Child, the guy I mentioned who collected these in this 5-volume massive set, his go back to around the same era. The Middle Ages are the earliest ones that we know of. And a lot of the, a whole bunch of the earliest songs in the Child collection of songs are actually about Robin Hood. But the Fatal Flower Garden is derived from a 12th century or 13th century ballad that was probably sung by a troubadour, who traveled from, town to town. And it was originally called Little Sir or Little Saint Hugh. It's a ghastly story about a little boy who's murdered. It's just bizarre to find it on a hillbilly recording from like 1930, sung by a duo, I think from North Carolina, Nell Stone's Hawaiians. They're called Hawaiians because there was a trend at the time to do hillbilly folk music with steel guitar, so it sounded like the Pacific Islands. It makes the song even more haunting because there's this luau feel, and then they're singing about this boy who's tempted into a yard because he throws his ball in there, and then there's a jump cut in the song where he's on his dying bed and he's like dictating his last wishes. It's an example of how these murder ballads sometimes have sections of them removed or facts removed. So by the time we hear them, they're even more mysterious and weird. But it's actually rooted in this story about Little St. Hugh or Sir Hugh, and it's a blood libel murder. It was one of these horrible times in the Middle Ages where Jews were accused of killing a boy, and all this madness descended on the town, and they hanged all these co-conspirators because a Jewish merchant admitted under torture, of course, that he had committed the murder, and it was part of a crime, a Jewish conspiracy to kill Gentile children. So it's a horrible, horrible story. But for me, there's just something absolutely bizarre about the fact that it ends up centuries later, a version of it ends up in a 1920s or 1930s hillbilly side that's collected by Harry Smith and Harry Smith was a smart enough guy. He saw the ironies of these things. He was an animator, an inventor. He designed this set of songs like a kind of a cult document.
I kind of cherry picked some of the songs I want to ask you about. One we go to the mid 50s for, and this is "I'm Gonna Murder My Baby" by a Memphis bluesman, Pat Hare. Is that the pronunciation? Pat Hare. You write that this song from 1954 proved prescient in remarkable ways. Can you talk about this song, how this would be a prediction of what was to come sonically in rock music, but also how it forecast the doom for the man who created the song?
Absolutely. Yeah, Pat Hare, his given name was Auburn Hare, which is the worst blues name I can think of, next to Howlin' Wolf and Sonny Boy Williamson and Blind Willie McTell and so forth. But his grandmother mercifully gave him the nickname Pat. But he was a terrific blues accompanist. He didn't do a lot of sides on his own, but he played with Howlin' Wolf, with Sonny Boy Williamson II, most famously with Muddy Waters. In fact, he's on Muddy's Muddy at Newport album. That's him. He replaced Jimmy Rogers, Muddy Waters' famous guitar player. But he was a drinker. And, like a lot of cases we all know about, he was amiable when sober. And when he was drunk, he was a real pistol. The thing that's kind of fascinating about it, there are two things that are most interesting to me. By the early 50s, Sam Phillips, the musical genius who gave us Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash, and also found a lot of blues talent. But he hired Hare to work for Sun Records in Memphis as an accompanist. Hare did so, and he recorded one 45 single while he was there under his own name that Phillips never released. And I've never been able to find anything that explains why. But if you listen to it, you can kind of figure it out. It was this just incendiary electric blues song called "I'm Gonna Murder My Baby." There are two remarkable things about it, which you alluded to, that I write about. The first is that this came out the same year as Elvis's "That's All Right Mama," which is the beginning of the rockabilly rock and roll era. And it sounds like Hendrix and Led Zeppelin because he's got his little amp cranked up to the point where it distorts. The sonics are just astonishing. And he does these guitar runs that look forward to hard rock and heavy metal. But it's 1954. Then on top of it, he sings this outrageously dark comic monologue where he's announcing to a judge and jury in advance of his own crime, "I just want to tell you, I'm going to murder my baby if she don't stop cheating and lying." Now, there are lots of cheating and lying songs in the blues, in country music, rock and roll, rap, but this one is one of the darker ones that you'll find, especially in the 50s. And I think Sam Phillips must have just kind of thought, this is a little too out there, so he held it back. But then the second thing that's so interesting about it is that the tragic irony that he fulfilled the idea of the song. His drinking got worse. He was often on the lam running from warrants from state to state. But Muddy wanted to keep hiring him because he was a good guitar player. And he ended up in Minneapolis at some point, and he was involved with a married woman. He was convinced that she was cheating on him. And deep in his cups, he took some shots at her window one day and then finally busted into her apartment, and he shot her and a first responder police officer, and both of them died. And he claimed that I not even remember it later because he was so drunk. He actually got sober in prison. He went to AA. He quit drinking. He played in the band, the prison band, which was called Sounds Incarcerated, which I think is a funny detail.
That's great.
And he actually, he was such a model prisoner that he was probably going to get paroled, but he died, I think, of cancer when he was just in his 50s. But it's an incredible story. And for a long time, it was a hard track to find. You can find it on YouTube now, but it's still kind of startling to hear. It's because it's just a really severe kind of larynx shredding vocal with this guitar that just, you can't believe is being recorded in 1954. I mean, it sounds like the Stooges or Led Zeppelin or something, a full 10, 15 years later.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. There's a song in the book from 1984 by the Smiths called Suffer Little Children. This song was inspired by a true event and one that clearly affected one of the songwriters, which is Morrissey. The Moors murders between 1963 and 1965 in northwest England. 5 children were murdered by a demented couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Many of the victims were only a few years older than Morrissey, who was born in 1959. This would seem to be a cathartic song for Morrissey to sing. Do you feel that that is what compels an artist to write a murder ballad? Is there usually a strong personal connection to the song?
It varies. I think that there's got to be something. I mean, there are people who, obviously recording a song that's about something sensational can also, get you noticed. And certainly there's folks, and especially in rock and roll, tried as much. In that instance, one listen to the song makes it completely clear. It's utterly sincere. It's a haunting song. It was one of the first songs that Morrissey and Johnny Marr put together for the Smiths. And he was from Manchester, and this was in Manchester, in the Moors is where these killings took place. Like you said, they were committed by this deranged couple. Ian Brady was a Nazi sympathizer and a sadist and was diagnosed a psychopath in Britain. But Myra Hindley was just a secretary, real average young woman. She came from an abusive background. I don't want to oversimplify, how something like this could happen, because part of what makes the songs haunting is the fact that we just can't understand how these things can happen. But they coaxed children into their car, assaulted and killed them, and buried them on the moor. And then they would go back and have picnics. It was really ghastly. There's a song by Richard Thompson that I write about in the book too. Both he and Stephen Morrissey grew up with this in the background, overheard at dinner tables with their parents, and saw the scary pictures of the police and all these dogs looking on the moor for the bodies and stuff like that. It clearly haunted them. Morrissey's lyric that he wrote for it is very, he was a guy influenced as much by romantic poets like Keats and Wordsworth as he was by the New York Dolls. It's a really haunting song where the children themselves sing to Myra Hindley, "We will haunt you when you laugh. You might say we're a team. You might sleep, you might sleep, you might sleep, but you will never dream." That's like a curse from the victims, And it's a song that its loveliness is in dire conflict with its subject matter, which often, makes a song more haunting.
So the next question is from a listener's perspective. Maybe it's the same thing. Is it any different from the artist who wrote it? Is there something personal that we're tapping into when we're hearing these songs? These types of songs, I think every bit as much as we're fascinated with death. Jim Morrison was a guy who was fascinated with death.
Yeah. Well, rock and roll was one of the places, certainly in the 60s and then into the punk era, where you were sort of allowed to go to the dark side. But I think, if you look at popular culture, I mean, Stephen King sells more books than anybody in the country, probably. It's funny. I like I said, some people assume this will be a lurid book. And I don't want to judge anybody. I'm interested. I'm drawn to dark things. I grew up with horror movies and scary comic books and stuff like that. And I love all that stuff too. But I think that there is a need. People have a genuine human need to pursue that shadow side of life in order to tolerate the kinds of often violent reversals of fortune they're going to face.
I can't remember. I just heard somebody say it somewhere. Maybe it was in a TV show or a movie, but he said, I like scary movies because they make real life less scary.
Absolutely. And they're safe. It's like a fairy tale. You know, it starts with once upon a time and ends with they lived happily ever after. Even if it ends horribly, it's just a movie. It's just a damn movie. So it gives you a safe outlet. I think that's a real important part of these songs. It gives you a safe outlet to face some of our worst fears and some of our most traumatic emotions. And I think it's essential to have a way to make stories about things. And, you know, not to go too far into it, but I would also say that the thing that makes a dark story or a tragic story tolerable in music, for example, is a good tune. You make some beauty out of it. You know, a lot of modern art confuses people because they say it looks frenzied and crazy and ugly. And, you know, when I used to teach at the Art Institute Chicago, I would say, well, that's because the period in which it was made was pretty awful in a lot of ways. And people are trying to make as best they can something aesthetic out of that chaos. And I think that you can apply the same thing to, you know, a fine art painting, to a John Carpenter Halloween film, or to one of these dark songs.
Let's get to the drive-by trucker song, Two Daughters and a Beautiful Wife from 2008. This reminds me of something that happened nearby in Connecticut, the Cheshire Home invasions.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought about. Right near me, next town over.
I remember that. One of the changes that we ended up making in the book, my publisher, Feral House, a wonderful publisher of kind of off the beaten track, edgy books, but they decided, you know, let's avoid first person accounts and so forth and stick to a more objective voice in the book. Because I lived in Richmond when the murders happened that inspired Pat Hood of Drive By Truckers to write that song, Two Daughters and a Beautiful Wife. And so I didn't include any personal content, but it really affected me very strongly, that one, because I was a part of the art and the music community in Richmond. And Kathy and Brian Harvey were very well known and very well loved within that community. They had two small children. Brian was in a band called House of Freaks, who long before the White Stripes had a like drummer guitar duo thing going with kind of a rockabilly, you know, kind of sweaty, punky rockabilly sound. But he had pretty much quit music to raise a family. And, you know, they lived in a really nice, you know, sort of middle class neighborhood in Richmond. Brian inadvertently left his door ajar one morning. It was New Year's Day. They were going to have friends over for a party on New Year's Day. And a couple of ex-cons were cruising in a van looking for a house to rob. And they slipped in. It was a home invasion. They slipped in. They held the family, tied them up, and held them captive in the basement. It just turned into this chaotic nightmare. They used a hammer and a knife to bludgeon and stab them to death. They were helpless and had to watch each other die. And then they stole a wedding ring, a laptop. It was just an unfocused, like we were saying a moment ago, one of these crimes where you want to find a reason to make it more tolerable, you know. But Pat Hood, who's a great guy, I'm a huge Drive By Truckers fan. I interviewed him about it, and he just said that it so disturbed him because he had just had his first child when this happened. And he knew the Harveys. They were not close, but he knew them. And he saw it on the TV, and it just blew his mind. And he just had to do something. And, you know, he's a composer, musician, songwriter. So he wrote a song, and he wrote it in the, you know, he's I think he's an agnostic. He's not a religious guy, but he wrote it from the point of view of a father in heaven who doesn't know why he's there, which is actually an old country motif you find in a lot of songs. There are letters from heaven songs. But he adapted that idea and, you know, wrote this very poignant song about how in heaven maybe everything is Saturday morning, two daughters and a beautiful wife, just romping with your kids. He said that was the most peaceful image he could think of, was the family romping on the bed, carefree, and that he had to write a song with that image in it in order to process the grief of what happened.
Now, initially, he was hesitant to put the song out, but there was something that ultimately eased his concerns.
He was hesitant to talk to me, too. Patterson, he's a real approachable guy. I mean, he's the kind of rock star you like, who like you can talk to him after a gig or whatever. And so I was able pretty easily when I started writing that to contact him. But he told me after the interview that he felt relieved because he was really nervous that I was going to write some tawdry, ugly thing. And that was a real concern for him and for me in this book. There's a funny thing that happens with a tragedy. As we get some distance from it, we can joke about it. You know, the Lizzie Borden house, where she axed her parents to death in the 19th century, is now an Airbnb. And, you know, they advertise it on Halloween. You can go to the murder rooms and sleep there and so forth. And some people find that distasteful, but I don't think people get really upset because it was long ago enough. There are a few tragedies in this book that were recent enough that I really, really wanted to be careful to make sure that I was respectful, that I didn't pull any punches about what happened, but that I also, you know, I just wanted, like Pat Hood did, to be cognizant of the fact that these are real people. You know, these are real, precious, unique, lost souls. And something happened to them that's just unforgivable, you know, or unimaginable.
We did mention Dylan's 2020 song, by that is 2020, the Murder Most Foul. But there's another song in the book from 1965, Desolation Row. That's among his greatest songs, the epic final track on his album, Highway 61 Revisited, an album that you aptly describe as a careening folk masterpiece. You spotlight the opening lyrics, and I want to ask you about this. The lyrics are, they're selling postcards of the hanging, they're painting the passports brown, the beauty parlor is filled with sailors, the circus is in town. Can you talk about these, as you write, curious words and why they stand out to you?
They stood out to me for years. He's just a great writer. And wow, that's a kind of, you know, there's this sort of carnival feel of like, you know, even if you don't know exactly what the images are and what they mean, it's just evocative. But I thought, you know, what a callous image. They're selling postcards of the hanging. You know, I thought it was just like about a kind of callous commentary on consumerism at its worst, you know, hawking postcards of an execution. Later, I found out it came from life. There's a little known phenomenon. It's better known now, but it's a chapter of American history that has just been, you know, kind of put into the memory hole for a long time. And it's the phenomenon of lynching postcards. And what that means is in the 19th century, up until the 30s, it was a common practice. Lynching, of course, we now have a better idea how common lynching primarily of Black Americans was. But they used to take photographs and distribute them as postcards. They would pose people beside these miserably abused and murdered accused criminals who never went to trial. They'd bust them out of jail and hang them from a lamppost or something. They're mostly Black men. I mean, a quick aside, there's a collection of these that were put together for an exhibit, and it's called Without Sanctuary. It's the one book in my library I can't look at. I just can't look at these pictures. And it's not because they're so gruesome. It's because I see human beings like me smiling, laughing, pointing at this. And it's another example where it's just so hard to take. I don't know what to do with it. But Dylan, his father lived just down the block from a place where one of these lynching postcards was made in Duluth, this seaport, Duluth. You know, everyone knows Dilling's from Hibbing, Minnesota, but his father was from Duluth. I forget the year. I think it was about 1910. But the circus came to town, and a couple of teenagers claimed that they had been attacked and robbed by Black roustabouts. Anyway, a mob descended and dragged these people to I think it was 15, 16 Black men to a kind of kangaroo trial. And they decided that three of them had done this. It later turned out It was completely dismissed in a civil investigation later, but they strung them up on a lamppost and took a picture. And Dylan learned about this from his father. Well, once you know that quality of the song, which is kind of a phantasmagoria about American culture, and a lot of it, is darkly humorous, it really contextualizes it in a dark way. And Dylan, of course, in his early music especially, wrote a lot of socially conscious anthems like The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll and Masters of War. We all know those songs. By the time he did Desolation Row, he was moving away from that. He wanted to write more visionary stuff that was less explicit. And he didn't want to just be a spokesperson, for kind of a political spokesperson for his generation. But it's not like his conscience went away. He still cared deeply about civil rights and stuff like that. But yeah, that I mentioned that in a chapter about lynching songs. And the two most famous that I talk about are Miss Otis Regrets by Cole Porter and Strange Fruit, which most people know that Billie Holiday did such a devastating version of for so many years. My favorite things are music, art, and film. I mean, I just can, and I love books, but things will stick with me. Something I hear, something I see. And it used to be you had to go to libraries and, sift through all sorts of records and stuff. The internet certainly makes it easier sometimes to find where
it sure does. Well, this is what I'm doing as we speak, because there's a lyric in Murder Most Foul that gives me the chills. And that is the one he says, riding in the back seat with my wife. And then the following line is headed straight on into the afterlife.
Yeah. And just an aside, the chapter where I talk about that song and about JFK songs, I build it around a really weird Lou Reed song, or an unusual for him Lou Reed.
That's, boy, you read my mind. That was another one I wanted to ask you about. That's the day John Kennedy died.
Yeah, and it's from the Blue Mask, which was kind of his return to form in the 80s. He got sober, he got married. He, after years of being sort of the poster boy for decadent rock and roll behavior, he said, I want to be a poet. I want to be, because he always had literary aspirations for rock and roll. And so he made this terrific record called The Blue Mask. And it just, every song is like a chapter in a book about, where he's at that point in his life, or what he's feeling and thinking about. And the oddest one is this kind of plaintive ballad called The Day John Kennedy Died, where he, in typical Lou sort of atonal phrasing, sort of recites this lyric about, he goes back and forth between his own memories at Syracuse University. Like so many boomers, he remembers exactly where he was when it happened, when the Kennedy assassination happened. And then he contrasts that with really moving lines about, I dreamed, he starts all these lines with, I dreamed there was a point to life. I dreamed that all these idealistic things that clearly Kennedy meant to him, and so many others from that generation that was shattered when he died. I didn't mention it in the book, but the quote that you just gave from Murder Most Foul reminds me that the next song on that, I think it's the next song sequenced on that song, maybe not, but I think it is The Heroine. And it's a ballad. It's sort of indistinct or unclear who it's about, but it's about this woman he admires. And he later acknowledged it was Jackie Kennedy. And of course, Jackie, this is before I was born, but I know the images. I know her with the blood spattered dress and just how strong she had to be. But there's something very moving to me about somebody like Lou Reed, who could be so cantankerous, such a flat, I love his music and I wouldn't have wanted to be in a room with him, but there's something very moving to have him be so vulnerable like that John Kennedy's death really, really crushed him.
And one song in the book that I'm super familiar with, but I'm not sure how many people are, and it's a crazy story. It's the Charles Manson song Cease to Exist, and how this becomes a Beach Boys song. Yeah, what's the story behind this one? Share for those who may not be aware of this one.
The middle, right about the middle of the book, is the longest section in the book, and it's called Charles Manson Murders the 60s. And I won't go into great detail. It focuses on a song by Sonic Youth called Death Valley 69 and a Neil Young song called Revolution Blues. but I also mentioned that song. It's hard to know how much of the Manson lore people know, but Charles Manson, when he was getting out of prison in 1967, his plan was he and his followers, the family, they called it Operation Superstar. Manson had learned to play guitar. He was actually taught by Alvin Creepy Karpus of the Ma Barker gang when he was in prison how to play guitar. He was a competent guitarist, a competent singer. That's all I can give him.
Yeah. And that other guy, by the way, is in a lot of those documentaries. Alvin,
yeah.
What's his name? Alvin
Karpus. His nickname was Creepy. Yeah.
Yep.
He was excited by the Beatles, and he said, well, when I get out, I'm going to go to the hedonistic wonderland of California, collect followers, and I'm going to become a rock and roll superstar. Before the murders happened, before the Tate LaBianca killings happened in 1969, he was a fixture in the Hollywood, Topanga Boulevard, etc. area. Neil Young ran into him. A lot of people did. But Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, the Wilson family, we all know now, were a troubled family. They had an overbearing father who was abusive towards them. And Dennis always had drug and alcohol problems and so forth. He seemed to have trouble figuring out what's a healthy place to be. And he came home, he picked up a couple hitchhikers in the middle of the hippie days that he didn't know were members of the Manson family, because no one knew what the Manson family was. He brought him home to his fancy bachelor pad on Hollywood Boulevard. Then he went to a Beach Boys session. When he came back, there was this weird little Jesus-like guru standing in the driveway.
The wizard. He's the wizard.
And he saw him and thought, this guy looks dangerous. And he said, you're not going to hurt me, are you? Anyway, long story short, the Manson family ended up crashing at Dennis Wilson's place for quite some time. And first, Wilson was caught up in it and thought, I'll try to help promote, Manson's music. And there are stories about them actually recording, and Brian Wilson, Mike Love being there, and with the Manson family recording. Dennis said that they erased the tapes. But anyway, long story short, this went on for a while, and the family helped themselves to his wardrobe, his cars. He was hemorrhaging money. He eventually got so scared of the family that he just left, and I think he had his manager throw them out. But Charlie was really angry at him because he had said he was going to help his music career. One of the main reasons he was pissed was because Dennis had adapted his song "Cease to Exist," a Charles Manson composition, which was originally, I think in the book I call it, an ego-fried anthem to ego death or something.
I love the way you worded that. Yeah, the death of the ego. Yeah, surrender the ego.
That was a big part of the acid thing. Right. The ego must die. It had sadistic overtones. It was, cease to exist and I will dominate you. Dennis Wilson transformed it into a love song, an unlikely love song, by changing it to cease to resist, and called it Never Learn Not to Love. And he actually recorded it with the Beach Boys. It's the B-side of their single Bluebirds Over the Mountain from a year before the Tate LaBianca murders. Dennis took sole writing credit, which I think is probably justified because they took a lot of his money. But he terrorized Dennis Wilson. He extorted money out of him. He threatened his child. He delivered 38 caliber, I think, bullets to his mailbox and stuff like that, and really scared Wilson pretty badly. Wilson said he was tremendously relieved that he was later arrested for murder. But that song, it was even on the Mike Douglas show. If anyone's old enough to remember the Mike Douglas show, you can find that clip on YouTube. And Dennis is in hippie clothes and he croons this song with sincerity. And it's just one of the creepiest artifacts of the 1960s you can find. The first version of that part of the book I ever wrote was actually first published years ago in Murder Ballad Monday. And when it came out, Manson was alive. He died of cancer several years ago. And I thought, he's got a lot of followers still. I wonder if he's going to read this thing that I wrote about him. And I knew that Ed Sanders of the Fugs, he wrote a book about Manson called The Family. And Manson was so angry with things that he said in it that he mailed him a cow tongue. Sanders found this wet box in his mailbox and there was a cow tongue in it. And after that article came out, I went to the mailbox with some trepidation for a while, just fearful that Charlie would send me a.
So when the news of his death came, you were relieved.
Yes, yes.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. A couple more songs to wind down. The story of the Clash song, Somebody Got Murdered from 1980. Now, this is interesting because this is not only about a true event, but an event that literally just happened, right? I mean, Joe Strummer, he was being asked to write a song for a film, and then he saw something.
Yeah, I closed the book with that song. I'm a huge Cash fan too, Johnny Cash.
Well, we'll get to Johnny Cash too.
Yeah, and for me, Joe Strummer was one of those, John Lennon type deaths. Just somebody. He kind of lost his way after the Clash for a while, but then he was really coming back, and he was doing a kind of world music thing. There was that great moment in the movie about him where he said, "Yeah, I used to make fun of hippies, and then suddenly I realized I am a hippie."
Yeah, yes.
So there was a more expansive, warmer Joe coming around. But anyway, so big Clash fan. But yeah, Sandinista Clash fans will know the Clash put out London Calling in 79-80, which was this dynamic, brilliant double album. And then they're like, well, they sold it as it was priced as a single. And they said, well, let's do one better. Let's put out a triple album. And they put out a triple album called Sandinista. Well, inevitably, you're going to have some filler. You run out of your best songs. So it's a weird record. It's very much the White Album of the Clash. It's got some great songs and then some really strange songs. But tucked in the middle of it is this song called Somebody Got Murdered, which feels like it's going to be a kind of punk anthem. But it's really strikingly, it has a very tragic feeling of pathos about it, because it's just about, it's about stumbling on a body and then just asking questions about how did this happen. And it was, as you alluded to, it was based on an actual event. Strummer had been asked by William Friedkin to write a hard kind of punk number for a movie he was making. And Strummer said, okay, and got off the phone. And the first thing he does is he goes to a parking kiosk in London, and there's this young guy who's just been, I can't remember if he was shot or stabbed to death, but he's laying in a pool of blood beside the kiosk. And apparently, as with some of the other crimes that we've been talking about, it was like for £5. They took like a £5 note and killed the guy. And that inspired it. He wrote the lyric immediately, and then he turned the lyric over to Mick Jones, his then songwriting partner, who wrote the music and sang it. And the song is written as a kind of a series of thoughts, and the most moving thought that he has for me is, he says at one point, I've been very hungry, but not enough to kill. And for me, that's the very soulful, philosophical quality of Joe Strummer, because he's trying to put himself in the shoes of this killer. And he's thinking maybe he was desperate. Maybe he was hungry. Maybe that £5 seemed like the only way he could survive. But for me, that's the line that just gets me every time. I've been very hungry, but not enough to kill. That's the story of that song.
The late, great Joe Strummer, and the late, great Johnny Cash, too. One last song to ask you about, which is Johnny Cash's cover of the Nine Inch Nails song Hurt from 2002. What do you think it is about his version that stands up so much more than the original? Which I love the original from Nine Inch Nails, but there's something about that Johnny Cash version.
Well, I think it's telling that Trent Reznor says it's not his song anymore. I mean, Reznor himself acknowledged that Cash, he owns the song now in death. And he wasn't bitter about it. He said that when he first heard it, it sounded alien to him because it was a very personal song that Reznor had written. I think about his own heroin addiction and a breakup in his life. And he was a fairly young man when he wrote this, and so it's that kind of gloomy Gothic industrial sound is sort of tailor-made, I think, for angstful young people. Nothing wrong with that. We all had something like that. And it doesn't mean that you don't like it later, but Cash took that song. And if you don't know the story, this was for the Rick Rubin produced American recordings that Cash did late in his life. It revitalized his career. And the thing that Rubin did that was so smart was two things. He stripped Cash down to just Cash and the most simple instrumentation so that incredible voice could dominate. And the other thing he did was he fed him songs. He fed him hip hop. He fed him Depeche Mode. He's like, "Have you heard this song?" And Johnny Cash was open enough to hearing new sounds that he would listen to these CDs that Rubin would burn for him. And one of the songs on there was Reznor's "Hurt," which on the Nine Inch Nails version is a kind of dark, gothic, very dramatic song. And it is powerful. But Cash took it. He changed one word and left the whole rest of the lyric intact. But he turned it from a song about like a young person's angst into a song about an old man facing death. And then it's an absolute rarity in that it has a video that goes with it that is absolutely perfect for the song and just as good in its way. It has Cash, sitting at a banquet table with a guitar.
He looks weak. He's frail. It's
shocking to see because
it's a man looking back at his life, just some regret. My Empire of Dirt is the one that really, those lyrics had to have spoken to him because he was looking back like, what was it all worth it?
Well, and he's at the, it's interspersed with footage when he was young and robust and handsome and healthy. And then we see the House of Cash, this, country Western museum that's just in a shambles with broken gold records. And so that line that Reznor wrote, "And you can have it all, my Empire of Dirt." He was a Christian. And so partly he's saying, partly I think he's lamenting feeling like he wasn't his truest self or his best self while he was alive. But I think he's also, just looking on his past and everything that he accumulated and thinking, what's it worth?
The money, the fame,
in the end, what matters? And also in the end, what part of what moves me about that song and the video is also just that in the end, we're all the same. It doesn't matter what you have. In the end, we're all going to face death and the unknown of what happens after death. And of course, one of the most poignant shots in that video is of, his bedrock partner of so many years, June Carter, standing on the stairs at one point watching him, and her face flutters with emotion. And it doesn't feel corny or exploitative. It just feels incredibly emotionally direct and soulful, and a great man at the end, debilitated, and his body, he had all these ailments. But there's such, his daughter Roseanne said it was something like it was a brilliant, gripping work of art. And how could anyone complain about that? Because some people thought it showed him too frail. But for me, the very brave and extremely moving song. And I wanted to close the whole book with it. As a kind of coda, even though it's clearly not about murder. It is just about the fact that, we all face death and we all have to find a way to make peace with it.
A great artist has the courage to bear all.
Yes.
So he puts it out there. I look weak. I look frail. I get it. But this is me right now. This is me at the end of my life. Yeah. It's a powerful, it's like the song was written for him. Yeah,
it really is just almost mystical the way that worked. And it's interesting too, because there were shared overtones between those two guys. They were both kind of brooding men who had been through drug addiction, come out of it. There were years in Johnny Cash's early career where he was on death polls. He was so messed up on amphetamines, and the people thought he wasn't going to survive. But he did survive. But there's almost a father-son feeling, for me, to the two versions of the song. And they were both very complimentary of the two versions. But yeah, I'll mention, I guess in closing, just that I happened to be in grad school at that time. This was shortly after my first wife's death. And so I went to grad school late. I got my MFA so I could teach college. So I was the old guy. All the other painting students were 20-somethings. And this was the heyday of sort of postmodern conceptual art. Everything's detached and no one wants to express feelings. It's all about ideas and concepts and stuff. And that video of Cash singing that got passed around to like everyone I knew was watching it, and they were all in tears. These brainy art students were all falling apart at this song. And I say in the book, maybe that was Cash's final accomplishment. He made sincerity safe for ironists, referring to that kind of the way young folks, and I was one once too, will kind of fall back into irony, fall back into snark, because it's just a little too hard to sometimes face unflinching reality. And I think God bless him, because Cash introduced his music to a whole new generation, Gen X, and people are still discovering it because of those records.
Murder Ballads Old and New, a dark and bloody record. It's out now through Feral House, and you can find it wherever books are sold. And where can people find you online, Stephen?
They can find me at I have an art and author website, which is, I think, sljonesart.com. Feral House, my publisher, you can look there. I have a professional Facebook page. If you just look up Stephen L. Jones, you can find, frankly, if you just Google Stephen L. Jones, you'll find LinkedIn, you'll find Twitter, X, I'm sorry. You'll find all that stuff.
Yeah, I'll find them all. I'll put links on the show notes page too, so people can reach out to you.
Great, greatly appreciate that.
All right, Stephen, thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion, a fascinating book, and we've only really gotten to just a little bit of it. So much more in this book. So congrats.
Thanks.
On a great book.
No, I love talking to you. Love talking about it.
That's it. It's in the books.